Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I'll start with questioning. What we're talking about here is really we're comparing a visa program versus a visa waiver program. So I'd like whoever thinks they're best to answer this question. I want that exact comparison. I mean, Mr. Jenkins, you talked about lines of defenses. I mean, compare, for example, what happens today in Poland where they don't have a visa waiver program in terms of one of their citizens trying to get in the United States. What are they going to go through versus what is the citizen of the United Kingdom going to go through, and where's the enhanced security versus where are the vulnerabilities of going through the actual visa process versus the visa waiver? Let's start with you, Secretary Chertoff.
I would say, Mr. Chairman, the main difference is in the interview. I mean, what ESTA does in effect is it collects the same basic information you would normally collect in a visa process, but you'll have an interview with a consular official if you're in a visa country. That often tends to be, from a scheduling standpoint and a distance standpoint, a little bit of an impediment, which is one of the reasons countries like to be in the visa waiver program. Now, does an interview at the time of the visa add something? Yes, although we do interview people when they come into the U.S., and if we do pre-clearance, we interview them before they board the plane. Is the interview foolproof? No. I mean, if you look back to the 9/11, some of the hijackers got into the country with visas. They were obviously interviewed. So I would say the marginal value of the interview, at least as it relates to terrorism issues, is to my mind not great. And remember, the process of having these kinds of interviews originally began at a time we were focused on people who were going to overstay. They were going to come to the U.S. and not leave, and they didn't have a job at home. So although I don't want to understate the value of the interview, particularly in some countries. And I know we have, for example, DHS personnel in some of the Middle Eastern countries who do some interviewing and some work with the local intelligence agencies. I think, at least as it relates to Western Europe, it is of marginal value, but the measures put in place since then, coupled with our better intelligence analytic capabilities, I think largely closes that gap.
During those physical interviews, basically, do we fill out an ESTA application so that, the result of that is you basically go into the exact same process, the exact same security system as we have with the visa waiver program, but you just have that additional physical interview? Is it the exact same way that way, or are there differences? Dr. Frey, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm nodding. Yes, Chairman, that's generally right. I would say as a couple of points to that. One, the VWP deals with one particular category of visa, the so-called B visa for business or tourism purposes up to 90 days. So even in visa waiver countries, if personnel are coming for other reasons, they still have to go through the visa process. So just so we're clear on the scope of what we're talking about. ESTA, and ESTA gives us and gives the government enough information to run the vetting against the same databases that the visa applicants are run against. There are other questions on a visa form, but most of those relate to, as the Secretary noted, to economic issues. Do you have a job at home? Do you have a house? Things like that. And so the vetting is precisely the same. And then once you're done with that process, the layers that we've been hearing about that CBP performs, the PNR vetting, the airline information vetting, the vetting done at the ports of entry, that is precisely the same for all travelers, whether they come with a visa or with a visa waiver program. And I guess the final thing I would add for an apples-to-apples comparison is the interview, which again is not, you shouldn't discount the interview, but that happens the first time you apply. And many of these citizens from these countries get 10-year visas that are good for multiple entries during those 10 years. So after that first time, it's essentially like VWP anyway, without the additional ESTA every 2 years.
With 40% of travelers going through the visa waiver program, let's say well, first of all, with that statistic, I mean, with that reality right now, are we already having backlogs in certain embassies in terms of the non-visa waiver countries where there may be pressure on embassy and consulate personnel to quickly do an interview and not be as thorough as what might be required with the visa waiver program? Is that a possibility? And if we were to move away from a visa waiver program, would we start overwhelming a system and potentially reduce security? Mr. Jenkins.
In all of these matters of screening processes and intelligence processes, volume is an issue. And if we were to take the statistics that were cited at the introduction to this hearing, if we were to take the 19 million people currently traveling to the United States on the visa waiver program and dump them back into the consular interview process, we would either have a tremendous backlog or we would end up really overwhelming the consular capability to handle that kind of volume, and then you worry about an erosion of performance. So while I agree that the interview process is an important component, to expand its capacity to deal with the kinds of volumes that it would be faced with would not guarantee us necessarily an improvement in performance.
So I'm concerned right now, are there countries where there's such a backlog? Have you heard reports where people aren't being thoroughly interviewed, where even just the visa system itself might create a greater security risk than having a visa waiver program?
I think probably the State Department is best positioned to answer this, but I've certainly heard over the years in certain countries complaining about long wait periods, the lack of availability of consular offices in remote areas. I think they've moved to some degree to doing it via telepresence of some kind. But all of these things do wind up, there's a risk of eroding the value of the interview. And again, the more skilled the person trying to get in is, the harder it is to detect it. So there's no question that dumping more people into the system would run the risk of actually affecting even those interviews that continue to operate in visa waiver countries, because as Dr. Frey said, we do interview for visas other than the quick tourist or business visa.
I wanted to catch the Secretary before he has to leave. Coming from a manufacturing background, I'm familiar with ISO certification, and that occurs, I think the full audits are once every 2 or 3 years, but then you have 6-month surveillance audits. And in testimony in prior meetings, these evaluations, these audits occur every 2 years. Would it be much of a burden? Would it have value to go into, there's only 38 countries, with a skinny down team, at least doing a surveillance audit every 6 months just to keep things up to date? Would that have value? Would that be too great a burden on the Department? Would that be a good idea?
I think in terms of the Department's current resources, you'll have to ask them in terms of, obviously we're all living in a time of budget discipline, and all these things cost money. I think, within reason, increasing the frequency, at least of light surveillance audits, always adds value. The challenge is, of course, if you're overseas and dealing with host countries, they have their own issues. But I think in principle, at least asking the question and saying what additional could be done between 2-year periods is a good way of remediating problems that may be cropping up that you're not aware of. And I would say that after what happened in Europe in the last few months, the Europeans may be more in a mindset to work with us on that than would have been the case perhaps a couple of years ago.
Thank you. Senator Ayotte.
I want to thank the Chairman for holding this